Okay, so let's just jump into running a quick demo across the MITRE framework. And you guys can all head there. The link is attack.mitre.org. The link will be in the description below if you want to visit the webpage. And I encourage you, you've kind of visited now, you've kind of walked through some of the scenarios, you've started looking at groups, and started to poke around and really get a feel on how to use this platform. So I want to spend the next couple of minutes, maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes, just sort of walking through this platform. I think at first, when I sort of first came across this, it kind of can and will be quite overwhelming. And that's okay, right? So I'm here to sort of walk you through a best approach, things that I found to be quite useful, and then you can sort of go away and make your own sort of judgment and your own sort of calculated assessment based on what you kind of like and don't like about the platform. So without further ado, let's just scroll down just here a little bit. So the first thing that I like to do is when I get to the attack framework, I come down here and I've sort of looked at the different phases of the attack cycle. And, we've got all the axes from, if I just get my pen out here, you can see our recon phase, we've got our development phase there, initial access, execution, persistence, all the way down to, I guess, command and control and so on. So if I can just scroll across, let me clear that out, get my mouse. And if I can just tab across there, you can start to see that it's given us the entire life cycle across, a traditional attack, right? What's the impact? How do they take the data out? If they're doing exfiltration to command and control, how do they get in there and control those remote hosts, etc. And this is taken traditionally across what are the different types or the commonalities between, if I'm going to go away and do recon, how do we traditionally do recon? So it's taken those sort of techniques, it's taken those sort of tactics away, and it's just building out a framework that makes it easy for us now to go here at a single, pane of glass essentially, and start looking at, well, what are the different types of recon that we need to be aware of? So what I found to be super useful is this show sub techniques, and each sort of tactic has been broken down into, a naming conventions. They've given it sort of names. So, TA 0043 is our recon, initial access is TA 001, execution 002, persistence 003, and so on. So it's given it names, and then each sort of sub technique beneath that has also been given a unique identifier, a unique identifier. So each part of that is T1, 583, 001 is for domains. And if I look at drive-by, that it's got its own sort of tactics and techniques inside there as well. So each of these have now been broken down. It's sort of consolidated. We can start to see the difference between the sub view. I kind of like this a little bit more because it is a bit more intuitive. And then I don't need to sort of drill down individually. If I'm looking at active scanning, for example, I can look at the sub techniques and it's grouped them together. So it makes it easy if I just if I hover over this and go, okay, well, if I need to look at scanning IP blocks, well, what does that look like? And if I just go to that web page, you can start to then say, okay, well, the adversary may scan IP blocks to gather information that can be used during targeting. So public IP address may be allocated to organizations by block or target range by sequential addressing. So that's just saying, well, if you want to now look at that, you can look at, Team TNT. They're known for, that specific a procedure. The Team TNT are specific threat actors who are going away and doing, scanning of IP blocks, and this is how they do it. Mitigation techniques, you can read about the mitigation techniques. Says this mitigation cannot be easily mitigated with a preventative control, since it is based on behaviors performed outside of the scope of the enterprise defense and controls. Yes, efforts should be focused on minimizing the amount of sensitivity of data available to external parties. Okay, that's great. And then for detection, so monitor network data for uncommon data flows, process utilizing the network that do not normally have network communications or have seen, who have never been seen before, are suspicious. Okay, so that's great. So we need to know that. So where do we go to from here? So once we start identifying the different types of groups, we can start looking at those different types of techniques within the framework, right? So if it is vulnerability scanning, if it's word list scanning, so if we're doing some sort of directory busting and things like that, we can start looking at what type of tool sets again, but then what other sort of defenses, but then also the controls that we can go away. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that the MITRE is not going to show you a very specific mitigation technique. So if we're using a specific vendor, it's not going to show you and tell you hand by hand how to actually go away and mitigate it. It's going to give you a whole holistic overview, just like it's done here. But then what we can then do is take that away, either research it, go back to our SMEs and then have that sort of tabletop discussion based on, if we're doing scanning of IP blocks, then what do we need to be mindful of when these types of attacks are occurring? So, we can go away from there and build out our own threat profile based on each of these categories if we want to. So I'm just going to go back to the actual navigation bar and let's just continue to look through this. So, part of the recon phase would be that very first initial part of the assessment. So what I would do is I would look at, okay, if someone's going to be scanning, external scanning of external IP addresses, what are some controls that we can be putting in for our external perimeter if that's the case? And the same goes for internal scanning. So when we talk about scanning IP blocks, can we head over to bgp.he, for example, and then can we start doing our own recon to identify our service block within our organization? That's a very common, very quick way for a person doing recon to go quickly and validate that this subnet block aligns with this organization's autonomous system number, which is given by the service provider. And we can sort of start to match and identify that, yes, this IP address is obviously tied to this organization. So again, with, gathering victim data, how do we traditionally do that? All through hardware, through software, through firmware, through client configurations. Gathering of that information as well can be done through creds and email addresses and employee names. And if we start sort of drilling down to these, a lot of these are kind of self-explanatory. So if we start talking about, gathering of victim data, well, where does our victim data kind of live? And the first thing is, well, anywhere that you're going to have an employee's name, maybe the role and the title, the email address, the mobile number. If it's a web page that says, about us, and here's our executive leadership team, and you can get in touch with Barry, and Barry's email is barry@acme.com.au, and his mobile number is 04, So, stuff when you start looking at things like that, well, it's kind of self-explanatory in the sense of most of these attacks kind of happen at the recon phase that we kind of know. And then if we start drilling down into the specifics of it, and we've got, okay, well, how do people going to get credentials? Well, let's maybe start looking at ways that, if there are any publicly, historical breaches that have happened, do we have access to those accounts? So, we can start then profiling this to say if anyone gets access to the credentials have been changed, recycled of user accounts that have been disabled, there's no history of anyone that's worked with the organization in the last 2 years, all their accounts have been disabled or they've been removed or whatever the internal security policy says on the best way to sort of remove those accounts. Then you can start sort of drilling down and say, okay, well, we're not really worried about credentials anymore. Our main concern is maybe email addresses because we've got such a large database of customers, or staff members. Then we can start putting in certain controls around our most critical pieces. Maybe it's your marketing team, maybe it's the sales team, maybe it's a product and development team because they have to have a public facing, assets, or whatever that is. And then you can start putting in certain controls based on that. And again, you go through the procedure of examples. So there's some of the common APTs that sort of target are targeting, creds, email addresses, employee names, things like that, which are maybe selling them online or whatever they're kind of doing. You can start to see again the mitigation techniques on how we go away and mitigate these. So if I just read it from here, so efforts should be focused on minimizing the amount of sensitive data available to external parties. Yes. And then detection as well. So how do we detect any of this sort of traffic or this sort of information that's going to be occurring? Well, monitor for suspicious network traffic. Yes. We've got, especially if the source is known to be associated with an adversary or a botnet. Okay. So we can then even take some of those adversaries that are relevant to us through known IP addresses. Again, the IP addresses are always going to change, but if we've got certain indicators of compromises, we can then tie them into our security platforms as well that can then start to say, well, if we're getting now scanned by an XYZ domain name that maybe hasn't been used by, in many times or hasn't been used, in recent activity, then that's a potential indicator of compromise as well, because now maybe they're using that activity through that domain name, for example. So, analyzing the web metadata may also reveal artifacts that can be attributed to potentially malicious activity. Yes, such as referring to user agent strings and HTTPS fields. Okay, so it could be related to some sort of web traffickers there. So there's ways to sort of detect and mitigate again that they're sort of, detailing and defining here. So I'm just going to go back. So you kind of get the idea that, once we're in the framework itself, you can sort of start to drill down into, specific areas of the actual life cycle of the attack. Again, if we look at phishing, for example, that's the technique. So we've got the technique is, T1566 just here. And I'll get my pen out just so you can follow me. So T1566. And then we've got sub-techniques, they're labeled by 001, 002, 003. And those sub-techniques are, if I just clear the screen out, get my mouse, and then we've got, well, when we talk about phishing can happen through three means. We've got phishing, spear phishing through attachments, spear phishing through links, and spear phishing through services. Try saying that 3 times too quick. So adversaries may send phishing emails to gain access to victim systems. All information, all forms of phishing are electronically delivered. Okay, that's great. So then some procedure examples of some common APTs that are doing that, and then some mitigations and obviously detections and how we can start to detect if a phishing occurs. So kind of a bit self-explanatory there. What I want to spend the next couple of minutes on as well is, if I can just remove this, if we just head over to the group, so you kind of start to work out, the best way to sort of navigate these functions as we start operating within the actual matrix across MITRE framework. And this, again, you can just scroll across and you can start to go through, some of these sort of techniques and tactics as well. So you can start looking at persistence, if persistence is a key area, and start defining, well, what are some of the common ways that we're going to gain access to persistence and persist a certain service or persist a certain bit of infrastructure, and how do we go away and do that? DLL, if we're going to do dynamic link libraries and dynamic link loading and sitejacking and all that side of things, what do we need to be mindful of? And, you can start profiling on how you do that through here as well. So as we continue through, I want to show you what do we do from here. So what are the common, what's the sort of the next steps, and, how do you best work with the MITRE framework? So now that we're sort of familiar a little bit with the enterprise matrix here, and we've gone through and we started labeling, you don't need to go through every single one of these. So with the way that I would now group, or if I'm working with a specific organization, I'll just head over to the groups. And over here to the right side, if I just get the pen out, you can start to see that they've listed out a boatload of APT groups. Now, these are threat actor groups that are operating in a cross of different variants of industries. And what I would do from here would be is I would start to look at, if I'm working with a certain industry, if I just hit the find, and then I can find and look at, okay, if we're working with finance, I can go, okay, well, let's take a look at any sort of finance groups, right? So we can start to see, there's a bunch of APTs that are maybe targeting financial organizations, so G1009, so Moses staff, to, these guys. And then you can start maybe profiling based on the industry that, we're working with. If it's, financial, if it's gaming, if it's high fintech, whatever it is. And let's just maybe pick one and start going from there. So the one that I kind of know and like to use, I think it was APT 19 was a financial services one. And then you can start to see that these groups, they've been grouped, they've been given a name, associated groups. So these are the common groups that they operate by. And then you can start to see some information here around, when this group was created through MITRE framework and then last modified as well. And then we can start to gain some information here around what this APT group does. So these guys are a Chinese-based threat intel group, and they've targeted various industries, including defense, through finance, pharmaceuticals, and the list goes on. In 2017, a phishing campaign was used to target several law investment firms. So if we're operating through a law or an investment firm, that's maybe an AP2 group that could be coming after us, so we need to be aware of that. Some analysts track APT19 and DPanda as the same group. Clear open source information, the groups are the same. Okay, that's cool. So let me just get rid of all the lines there and go back to the mouse. And you can start to see that they've been grouped through common descriptions here. So they can operating through Sunshine, Sunshop Group, or Condoso, And then they're sort of falling in under the APT19 group. And then you can start to drill into some of the techniques that have been used. Now, a couple of features here that are kind of like, and this is how I would start grouping and start working with this if we're in a specific financial team and we go, okay, we need to define who are the APTs that could potentially be coming after us. I would come to this pane here, and then I would start looking at certain techniques that are used across the enterprise and how they're going to gain access to certain pieces. So if I just hit the attack navigator layers here and just view that, it will take me to a bit of an infographic where it sort of shows it. Let me just remove this. Okay. And then you can start to see that it's, instead of worrying about active scanning, it looks like this AP2 group doesn't do any of that sort of stuff, doesn't gather victim data through, other means of access through here. It looks like they kind of start through a drive-by compromise. So if I then just go back to here and then go back to our MITRE framework, and let me show the sub-techniques. And then let's look at drive-by compromise. So where are we at? So that'll be under initial access. So it looks like they kind of start from, drive-by compromising. And what is that? So the typical drive-by process kind of looks like this. So let's start at number one. So user visits a website that is used to host adversarial controlled content. Okay. Scripts automatically execute, typically searching versions of the browser. Okay. The user may require assists. Okay. So they're enabling the scripts. So it may enable some sort of user to go online and click the link and download something and run something. So typically a drive-by could be delivered through maybe a USB platform, could be done through a URL, so they can go www, badguy.com, and then they'll be hosting something on that platform that kind of resonates with, the actual attack. And then they can obviously download some sort of content or some sort of malicious activity on that machine. So that's pretty much the means of access on how they kind of do that from initial access. So you can start to say maybe it's through a spear phishing email. So as we now start drilling down to the specifics or the characteristics of this threat group, we can then drill down and say, okay, well, if phishing is going to be a main area for us and we look at spear phishing, so let's just go back and I'll go back and show sub techniques, and let's just go over to phishing. So phishing, and if I jump down to, let's have a look at the sub technique here, and let's go to spear phishing with attachment. Okay. And then we can start to look at, well, okay, well, if they're now going to be spear phishing either, my department or my organization, what are some of the controls that we need to be mindful of? So again, you can look at some procedural examples. So these are common APT groups that are doing this. It's quite a lot. And then as we continue to scroll down, we can start to see some sort of mitigations and detections there as well. So as we start being aware of these kinds of attacks, we can then start to either slow down or remove that process altogether. Part of that process maybe we're not going to be putting information on our website. So no email addresses, no mobile numbers, no information like that. So there may be a very strict protocol even around sales, even around marketing, and then we can start building in, both technical controls, but obviously through user training as well. How are we going to train our staff to identify these malicious, spear phishing emails as well? So, and then we've got our technical controls as well, how we start, monitoring and detecting the environment if something does occur that's going to be malicious. If a RAR file is sent, are we going to be doing inspection across all file attachments, regardless of who sends them or who's in the safe senders, list? And there's obviously certain areas and certain, controls that we need to be mindful of that need to be workshopped with leadership, that need to be workshopped with obviously our technical team, etc. So again, kind of an overview, but you kind of get the idea of it. And you kind of now, if we start looking at APT19, we can start drilling down into, this is how they typically like to operate. And if they're going to do persistence, well, they're going to do some sort of registry modifications and startup file executions. From there, they're going to probably start, obfuscating data and putting things that are malicious in hidden windows. And maybe they're going to be launching attacks that obviously going to be hidden, so it's going to be quite hard to detect. Side loading, if we're going to do dynamic link loading and dynamic link library ejections within DLL functions, and then the list goes on. So I'm just going to leave that one there open because I'd also like to maybe just do another quick example so you can start to see how different APT groups kind of operate. And the one that I want to look at is the Carbonac one that we had as an example the other day. So Carbonac was around almost 10 years ago. And if I just open this up in the other view, and then what I want to do is just sort of compare these side by side a little bit, so we can sort of start to see what are the different types and how they differentiate essentially. So if Carbonac, if we're a banking institute, for example, 10 years ago, this was probably, you know, another APT group that we had to be mindful of. And then they kind of operate a little bit different than APT19. And if I just bring these together, you can start to see that, you know, they've got certain tool sets that they're going to use. If it's, you know, PS exec, or if it's going to be Mimikat, or if it's going to be Cobalt Strike, you know, they're going to be using some sort of tool set that has capabilities to deliver some sort of payloads or to do something. And then from there, they'll look at valid accounts through, you know, maybe through domain accounts or through external accounts. They're going to get access to a cloud environment or some sort. Where APT19, they traditionally do a drive-by scenario. So they're going to get some information, host something online, and then have some sort of user interaction where someone is either going to go download something or you know, download some sort of function or download some sort of attachment through a speed phishing link, and then from there they'll get access to, you know, launch PowerShell, go away and modify registry edits, things like that. Where Carbonac will go away, look at valid accounts, and then from there it will start manipulating the Windows services, and then it's predominantly going to be Windows based, you know, looking at Windows services specifically. So if I just scroll here, you know, then we can start looking at, okay, well, valid accounts is one thing. So if we got valid accounts in the environment, well, one is I would start looking at internal Active Directory accounts. What are some mitigation techniques? So running these sort of simulations and emulating this, going back to our threat emulation piece, I will look at these and I'll say, look, well, how are we going to emulate these kinds of attacks? And there's ways to do this, which I'm not going to cover in this video, but you kind of get the idea now to start emulating the kind of attacks. If we're going to now go into an environment and get that initial access, well, what's the first thing that we're going to probably run on a domain, you know, on a network? Well, we're going to run potentially, you know, Wireshark. We're going to start looking at sniffing some traffic. Maybe we're going to try and install Bloodhound. You know, does Bloodhound have some indicators of compromise to start mapping the domain? Things like that, which we then can start profiling both, you know, PowerShell commands if we're going to be launching PowerShell. So you can start building out sort of controls around, well, how do we validate, you know, validation of accounts? And if we're going to start looking for accounts across the network, are we going to be launching Responder to try and capture those credentials in the network for some sort? So as you make those things harder to sort of detect, but also harder for, you know, the chain to even get into the valid accounts component. So if this part here, if I just get my pen out, so if we've kind of drew the line and said, look, we're going to mainly focus on our valid accounts, both from an external and internal perimeter. And we're going to put in the absolute most amount of controls based on these, you know, based on the valid accounts that are available to us. Well, then that makes things a little bit harder because they won't even be able to get to modifying Windows services and registries and stuff like that, because at some point they're always going to need a valid account. So why don't we take our due diligence and due care across our valid accounts and start mapping out, well, who's been in the organization for X amount of time? And then we can start looking at, well, are these the only valid accounts that need, you know, proper either secure by default, or, you know, we're looking at, you know, cloud accounts that could have been left there for maybe 10 years ago that we didn't know about. Really do your due diligence and due care on specifically these valid accounts, because then it makes things harder a little bit later down the chain, because they rely so much on valid accounts being valid. So as soon as you gain a valid account, then that may be a bit of a problem. And then you can role play and do a scenario-based assessment based on, well, if they do compromise a valid account, what can we start doing with services and stuff like that? So you can really play this out all the way to the end, right? So you kind of understand now that there is obviously different APTs that are operating. They have different techniques and the ways that they do certain things. So you can start to see these guys, APT19, kind of operate more in the registry functions. And then you've got, you know, other stuff here that they're doing, where, you know, Carbonac the group at Carbonac were doing different ways of sort of running these, different sort of attacks through the actual life cycle. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, and that's what I kind of wanted to spend some time sort of walking through with you. Feel free to obviously run through this. We're going to be spending a bit more time as well as we continue through this series to, demo and showcase and add some more value around how we operate and do things from a threat intel perspective. But what I really wanted you to sort of be aware of is the platform itself, how to best navigate it, what kind of worked for me, and then now you can sort of go away, you can start looking at these sort of groups and then start piecing out some information. So if I just look at this as another example, if we just spend some more time on Carbonac, the associated groups are here, yada, yada, yada. And then look, you can look at the techniques that are commonly used, open these up in another tab, you can print them out, look at them, and then say, well, Carbonac installs VNC software. Okay, well, it executes through DL functions of Rundle32. So if we're still running Rundle32 for whatever reason and VNC software is installed and hijacked through those DLL functions or those binary proxies, what are the controls that we then need to put in? So we can look at that as a function, understand it, what's susceptible to our environment, and put in a control around how we mitigate and obviously slow down that attack cycle. The other thing here is software as well. So Carbonac uses specific software. They like to use specific tool sets to launch attacks. So Mimikatz is one of them if they're doing some sort of credential attacks, and then you can start to see the techniques on the right-hand side here. So this is typically, why we're going to be using Mimikatz and obviously getting credentials or hashes and what are we then going to do with those hashes? So that's identifying those valid accounts from a specific trait that they like to use. And then PS exec is what to, get access to other systems across the network to pivot and so on. So that's what I wanted to spend some time on today. I hope you found this video useful. Again, if there's any other comments that you'd like to see in the videos, please let me know, and I'll see you guys all in the next video.